Here in New York City this week, I'm sheltering in place. So we should take and consider one of the most important environmental choices we make as a society. And that's our housing policy. Whether we use land to house ourselves has a big potential to preserve wilderness, cut air pollution, and bend the curve on climate change. You can take a look at the differences between land use and greenhouse gas pollution that causes climate change. If you take a look at Maryland and Virginia suburbs and compare them with urban DC, the suburbs have double or triple the emissions of a typical city household in Washington, DC. In almost every major metropolitan area, high emissions in suburbs more than outweigh the lower emissions in urban cores. With a need to slash overall emissions to avert the worst of climate change by 50% in a decade and 90% or more by the middle of the century, we can't succeed without a fundamental shift in housing and land use policies, both in urban cores like New York City and in suburbia. There are three main explanations for higher suburban emissions. You've got higher incomes, higher transportation emissions, and higher housing emissions. Why is that? The stark differences in transportation and housing emissions are simple to explain. They've got everything to do with housing policy. As Up for Growth put it in one of its insight reports, housing is the environmental issue of our time. America is dominated by a suburban environment with large single-family homes where long distances to work and amenities lead us to car dependence. This locks most of America into a life cycle and lifestyle of high carbon emissions. This pattern can be found in both red states and blue states, large states and small states, especially in car-centric California. So, California is both a national leader in fighting climate change. In 2018, more than half the state's electricity came from carbon-free sources, and it's a poster child for environmentally destructive land use policy, epitomized by sprawling suburbs. But state leaders in California have recently started to recognize the link between housing policy and climate change, and they've taken small steps towards addressing the problem. In 2008, California passed the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act to help reduce driving and sprawl. But Californians are driving more since the bill's passage. After a dip during the Great Recession, vehicle miles traveled per person increased by 14% for passenger cars and trucks over the 5 years back in 2017. As transportation accounts for more than half the state's climate pollution, when you count petroleum refining and extraction, this trend is overshadowing California's success in cleaning up electricity, and it's the biggest roadblock towards achieving the state's 2030 emissions goals, which the state isn't going to meet until 2050 if our progress doesn't accelerate. So why on earth are Californians driving more despite state policy goals? The simplest reason is that our transportation and land use decisions are not aligned with our climate goals. Like most of the United States, local governments have a near monopoly on the decisions of what and where to build, effectively zoning out the mixed-use, multifamily dependence that lessens car dependence. Even where such housing is legal, it is often smothered in endless review processes that are usually hijacked by a small minority of self-interested neighbors, NIMBYs. Meanwhile, our transportation spending and the rules of our streets still largely assume that private cars are the only form of transportation that counts. This makes cars the cheapest and most convenient option for many trips, effectively ensuring that alternatives never reach their full potential. Now, you've got single-family zoning in cities and nearby suburbs, long used in the United States as a tool for imposing racial segregation. This also led to more driving. This is because it limited these neighborhoods, as well as the high-quality transit and other amenities found in them, to just a small number of residents. Any additional residents of the metropolitan area, generally those with lower incomes who cannot afford a single-family home in a central location, are pushed into exurban areas, where they often endure long, polluting, car-based commutes. Over in the San Francisco Bay Area, a growing number of supercommuters drive more than 90 minutes every way to and from work. Even worse, the exclusion of homes from our cities has pushed more people into the wildland-urban interface, where tracts of single-family homes meet grassland and woodlands and risk being burned in wildfires. We cannot develop in woodlands and risk being burned in wildfires. We cannot. And back in Australia earlier this year, there were more and more fires. These things are only going to get worse if we don't change our course. We need bolder action. In this time of great suffering caused by a viral pandemic, it's clear we can no longer afford to be complacent with systemic risks to our civilization. In the past 10 years, we've made enormous progress in the electricity sector. And in recent years, a growing chorus of activists have called for banning or divesting from new fossil fuel projects, transitioning our electricity system to 100% renewable or carbon-free power, and eliminating the sources of toxic air pollution that choke our most vulnerable communities. It's a time for a similar argument for housing policy reform from within and beyond the environmental movement. Yeah, we can build more efficient homes, and yeah, we can switch to electric cars. But these efforts, while important, they're not sufficiently enough to address the urgency of the climate crisis. Governments must address the housing shortage and target future growth to benefit the environment and the economy at the same time. Housing policy should encourage multifamily infill development in both urban cores and in suburban commercial districts, especially near transit and job centers. This is going to bring about huge energy savings. A new multifamily home uses about half as much energy as a single family home in California. Even more, it would enable more Americans, especially lower income families, to finally say goodbye to car dependency and super long commutes. More research from Up for Growth underscores why focusing on urban infill development and building housing near transit has tremendous environmental benefits. If California was to address its 3.4 million unit housing shortfall through the so-called smart growth approach, the new housing could result in 36% less carbon emissions, 77% less land development, and 35% fewer vehicle miles traveled than under current building patterns. In state legislature, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez has proposed a bill that would help to accomplish this goal. Her bill, Assembly Bill 2345, will permit up to 50% more housing units in multifamily residential buildings in return for setting aside a percentage of units that are affordable to renters with either low or moderate incomes. This density bonus program is based on a similar law in San Diego that helped double apartment construction. Passing this bill, 2345, would help California take a meaningful step away from sprawl and car dependency. It would create more homes in walkable, mixed-use corridors with easy access to jobs and transit. It would help residents with low incomes, those who are likely to be pushed into super commutes by high housing costs, and allow them to afford to live near jobs and opportunity. And all of this would reduce carbon emissions and assist in the fight against climate change. Now, this bill alone is not going to solve environmental problems. No single bill can. But it can offer valuable opportunity to redefine housing and land use policy in a way that supports a much healthier climate. California's got to pass it. And other states should take similar measures to encourage climate